All right, so in this unit, we'll be talking about legumes. Legumes are popular around the world, and they have been for quite some time, in part because they produce many seeds, and those seeds, when they're dried, have a low moisture content. So that means that they're able to be stored for long periods of time. And that's very similar to what we saw with cereal grains. But one of the biggest difference between cereal grains and legumes, as far as that goes, is that cereal grains actually have a lower protein content. So by comparison, legumes have a greater deal of protein. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. In past writings, Italian writers have written about peas and beans and lentils back in the Middle Ages, and sometimes these crops were recorded to be part of crop rotations, and they've also been recorded to play influential roles and to help solve issues of malnutrition or times of famine, especially in the case of the Black Plague that took place in the late 1340s. Now, legumes are a term that encompasses several broad categories, including beans, peas, peanuts, and lentils. And beans include two major categories, physiolus, which includes navy bean, pinto, and black beans, and some others. And those originated or were domesticated in Central and South America, while other members of the bean family include glycine max, which is a soybean, which originated in China. Then we have peas, and these originated out of Asia. And some examples of those include vigna, or the black-eyed pea, out of South Asia, and then cicer, which is the chickpea that is out of Turkey. Then we have another category that is peanuts. Those were domesticated in South America, and then lentils that were domesticated in the Near East. Now, the legumes all are part of one plant family, just like we saw with the cereal grains. We're all part of Poaceae. In this case, are all part of Fabaceae. And by comparison, as far as if we had to rank plant families as far as food importance goes, legumes would be second to cereals. So these are two of the top most important plant families because so many of our food crops come from these two families. And it is also important to say that legumes or Fabaceae family includes not just these food crops, but other plants you may recognize, such as alfalfa, which we talked about in the last unit as a cover crop, but also trees like black locust, redbud, honey locust, and black locust, and they're displayed here at the bottom. It's a fairly large plant family, and unlike cereals, where Poaceae was all comprised of monocots, this family is comprised of solely dicots, many, many dicot species. Now, we also talked in the last unit about flower shape, flower morphology, and we said that sometimes flowers can be self-fertile and others can be designed in such a way that they increase their chance of outcrossing. And so in the case of legumes, these flowers are perfect. That means they have both male and female parts, and they're dicots, so they have 5 petals. They have bilateral symmetry. That is, if you sliced the flower down the center, they would be equal on either side. But if you sliced it in many directions, like say pie wedges, they would be unequal. And so we say they're self-fertilizing. They produce an interesting pod, and we'll show you a model of the pod developing inside the flower in lab this week. They're dicot, like I said, so they also produce 2 cotyledons that are inside that developing seed embryo. The other thing to note is it may be something that you've never noticed before, but pea flowers are slightly different in that they have this large petal in the back called the banner, and then the keel, it folds over the keel and the wing for protection. So it's kind of like, I don't know, like a clamshell. Like they close like two halves close together, and then they kind of fold open for pollination. Now, I alluded to the high nutrition content, particularly for protein resources in legumes. And the term legume is derived from legere, which means to gather. And the term pulse is one of those terms where you may have heard pulse or legume termed interchangeably. And pulse really derives from the word pulse or porridge, and it's meant to denote the types of dishes that these legumes were made into back in Roman times. And so, in general, they have a high protein content. They typically represent all the amino acids that your body needs. They have folate, which is important for embryonic development, iron, good source of dissolved fiber. And then there are some times where we have nutritional or anti-nutritional factors, and I'll talk about that, which is something we haven't come across yet. The seeds also, in addition to having high protein, they also have a high oil content. And so it is said that they are the poor man's meat because of the case that they can be eaten in place of meat, and yet you would still nutritionally be able to benefit from the protein and the oil, and really even easier to store in many ways than meat, especially in early days. So, like I said, sometimes you'll hear the term pulse in place of the word legume. And this is really just talking about the seed portion of the plant that a legume produces pulses. And typically pulses are the dried seed. And so we can see it as a dried pea or a dry bean or a lentil or chickpea. Okay, so pulses, legumes, we're going to use those terms interchangeably, just kind of like we said with cereals and grains. So if we start our discussion, we'll look at the category of peas, and peas have one genus and species that was domesticated, most common in our diet, Pisum sativum, and this might be familiar to you as the garden pea or a split pea. Of course, like we said, it belongs to the Fabaceae family, and it's thought that the origins are Asia. And a lot of writings would lead us to believe that it's one of the oldest cultivated or domesticated plant species, and remnants have been found in places such as Troy. It was imported into Europe, and today the main producers are Canada and France, as well as China. One of the interesting things about peas is they're quite cold tolerant, so they're one of our first crops that we grow in the springtime. And your reading talks about this as well, but there are two kind of broad categories: the garden pea, which we typically eat fresh, maybe even inside whole with the pod and the seed. And this is actually the immature developing seed pod, and it might be something we eat as like a sugar snap pea or a snow pea or a pea pod. All of these are garden peas, and they're consumed immature and fresh. Alternatively, you might be familiar with the dry field pea, and this is just a matured pea seed that may even be split in half, like split pea soup. And this is dried and has a long storage life, but really, there might be different varieties, but it's all coming from Pisum sativum, but it's whether or not you're eating it immature or mature. Now, split peas, we typically think of being green. They can be gray, they can be even tan or yellow. And it's really this yellow portion that is the cotyledon, or the developing seed leaf, that you're seeing. And peas were used in botanical research and also for our understanding of genetics with Mendel's work. And so remember the wrinkled and the round and the smooth, all those genetic attributes that Mendel studied. Now, also in this grouping, we have the pigeon pea, Cajanus cajan. This one originated in Western Africa, now produced mainly in India. And there's lots of stories about the pigeon pea, but it was reportedly introduced into Hawaii in the 1820s. And now it's quite popular and consumed both fresh and dried, and even can be used for flour. A dish that I like to make that has pigeon pea in it is actually called corn caviar. You may have even had it. It's like a corn salsa that has many different beans and corn in it. The black-eyed pea looks similar. This is Vigna unguiculata. It's related to cowpea. Cowpea is one that is a food for forage for animals, but this is adapted to warmer conditions. And your reading also talks about the black-eyed pea food as a traditional food served at New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, called Hop and John. And it's very popular in Nigerian and Ghanaian cooking in West Africa, as well as the Caribbean. And it's just simply, in some cases, mashed black-eyed peas with salt and onions or peppers. So that's a little bit about peas. Now, beans belong to the genus Phaseolus, and these were domesticated in Central America, Mexico. And there's also quite a great diversity in South America, but we would say the domestication point is Mexico. It was taken to Europe by the explorers, and there's many different types of beans. And actually in lab this week, you'll look at different bean shapes and colors, and some will be familiar and some may be new to you. Now, as far as the bean plant itself, it has two ways of growing. And I alluded to this when we talked about the three sisters, where the pumpkin was on the outside, corn was in the center, and then the beans would just grow up the corn plant for stability. So originally, beans were vining, and so they were also called pole beans. Later, with some genetic breeding, we also have varieties that are bush beans, and those are more commonly produced today. They're easier to grow because they don't need trellising. They are kind of hard as far as harvesting because of the fact that they only grow 2 feet off the ground. But in general, we have these two different categories of bush beans, which we call determinate because once they flower and fruit, they don't continue to flower and fruit. Whereas pole beans, the vining variety, will continue to grow fruit and flower indefinitely until the cold weather comes. Just like we saw with the peas, you can have dried and fresh variants. And so you can see them here as like green snap beans is what we would call them. And then there's all these different types of dried beans that are mature, and the green snap beans are the immature version. And they come in all lengths. We can see the wax bean in colors, wax beans being yellow and runner beans being more vining and fairly long in length of pod. And then the long beans, look at how long these are. This is in an Asian market, and this is a bean. It kind of looks like a stem, but it's not. It's a pod. If we look at certain genus and species or genera, if you look at kidney beans, this is Phaseolus vulgaris. It gets its name because it looks like it's kidney shaped. It can be confused with other beans like red or azuki, but the kidney is really very large compared to the red or azuki. It does have this little white spot right here. This is called the hilum. And you might have noticed even on the peas, they had this, like the black-eyed pea, they had a black spot. Here, it's a white spot. And basically, this is where the seed attaches to the ovary wall. There's like a little tiny stem that attaches them, called the funiculus, and the hilum is like a scar that's left behind. And that's a really good way to tell what species you have by just looking at the color and the shape of the hilum. Black beans are very popular in Spanish cuisine as well as Latin America, really all over the world today. They're also called black turtle beans, turtle because they have a tougher outer shell. And then navy beans, these have a white seed coat. They get the name because the U.S. Navy served these beans as a staple food for the sailors in the 1800s as a source of protein. Pinto beans or painted bean or strawberry bean, all because of the color and the modeling here. They're the most popular bean in the United States and in Mexico, and oftentimes you see it as refried beans. Fava beans is one that you may or may not have come across yet. Vicea faba, you might have heard in, certain horror movies, like I'll have the fava beans with a is one of the connotations to this bean, and it's not commonly found in the fresh form. Oftentimes you'll find it as it's dried, or maybe even canned. It has an importance in celebrations, especially during Lent, the time before leading up to 40 days leading up to Easter. And they're thought to be lucky beans. They're celebrated during this religious holiday of Saint Joseph, because these beans were thought to help sustain the Sicilians through famine. And so they produce a stew or a soup called St. Joseph's Day soup. And this highlights fava beans as well as chickpea, also broccoli and cauliflower. It's a vegetable stew because it's eaten on the holy days leading up, and they omit meat from their diet. Interestingly, some people that suffer from favism have a response to this type of bean, a hemolytic response due to a disorder with their metabolism linked to G6-PDD. And so this is problematic in their blood. So people that have this disorder cannot eat these beans. And that's kind of this idea of like anti-nutrition, and we'll get more into that here in a minute. Like I said, beans can be consumed fresh or dried, and if they're fresh, they can be boiled, fried, canned, frozen. They can be dried, they can be reconstituted and put into soups and stews and then canned. Okay. In some places in Mexico and Africa, they'll even eat other parts of the plant, including the shoots and the stems, in addition to the pods. Now, I alluded to this whole plant family producing seeds that are high in protein. But I just want to note that while we can say that protein, here we go, that beans are a good source of protein, they aren't a better source than meat, animal products like beef, fish, dairy, and eggs. They contain all of the essential amino acids, and so they're considered complete protein. So if we eat those sources of protein, then we are able to build muscle from those protein sources. It's true that beans are ones that produce many amino acids, and maybe even all the amino acids in some cases, but not in high enough concentrations, all of them, to be considered complete. So we would consider them incomplete sources of protein, such that they are not comparable to meat as a replacement. However, you can combine them with other sources of incomplete protein to create complete protein sources. And if you have a vegetarian or vegan diet, this is really important to consider. So typically combining a bean with rice or corn or nuts or seeds or wheat would be a way to consume these beans and also meet your requirement for complete protein. Something even as simple as like peanut butter on wheat toast or corn and rice, which is common in some parts of the world as a main dish, and that's why. So this was just to give you some examples, like a pinto bean taco or a black bean and corn salad, or beans and rice, or even baked beans on toast, which is really popular in the UK. Now, many of these seeds we said are high in protein, but they're also high in oil. So that makes them really good for plant-based seed oil, because they supply or they store a lot of oil in different parts of their seed. In the case of some seeds like coconut, they'll store it in their endosperm. Others will store them in their cotyledon leaves like peanut and soy. Corn will store it in their scutellum, and then in palm and olives, which we'll get to, will store it in their fruit pulp. But basically, we can extract those oils and use them for cooking. Oils in and of themselves are made up of a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acids looking like this. I don't want you to get too caught up in the chemistry of this, but it is important for understanding some of the consequences of these oils and why plant oils may in some ways be healthier oil sources than animal oils. One reason for that is they are a good source of this B category of unsaturated fatty acids. They are loosely packed together and at room temperature are in a liquid form. Conversely, saturated fats, because of their composition, they tend to be packed more tightly together and are solid at room temperature. And we'll talk more about why that's important later on. But one of the bigger reasons for making these distinctions, you may have heard of like saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats tend to get a reputation for being more problematic in your diet. It can lead to atherosclerosis or buildup of plaque, which is like basically fatty deposits in your blood vessels. And that's less the case with these more dispersed unsaturated fats. That's one of the biggest differences. Unsaturated fats also have this shape. Well, they can have 2 shapes. They can have the cis or the trans form. They normally exist in this cis shape, this bent shape, which makes them not as easy to pack together, and that's a good thing. But if you are trying to produce food that is shelf stable and also easier to produce, you might go through the process of hydrogenation. You may have heard of like hydrogenated vegetable oil, hydrogenated seed oil being problematic in the diet. It's mainly because of what they do chemically to change the form from cis to trans. So unsaturated cis is what you'd find in most seed oils, though you can chemically change the form of these plant-based oils to cause them to be trans. But that is problematic for your health then compared to saturated fats. These are ones that are more tightly packed together, more densely packed, and these are the ones you'd find in animal fat. So these are plant, this is animal, but if you had to pick between the 3, unsaturated in the cis form would be the healthiest one to choose. In general, we say most seed-based oils are unsaturated, but I did allude to a couple that, or the chance that some of them weren't. So some do produce saturated fats, that ones that are densely packed together, which is why we need to pay attention to that, like palm kernel oil or even coconut oil, which we tend to say is a good one to eat, but it kind of depends on what your goals are. They are saturated fats, so you do have to treat them kind of like you would if you were to eat animal fat as far as your health goes. So this hydrogenation is what I was alluding to with the changing from cis to trans. Basically, they add hydrogen gas and do a couple other things in here to generate the form that is trans instead of cis in those plant-based oils. Okay, so we're going to stop here and I'll pick up with part 2 here in a little bit.